So starting with the hours of service rules that apply to property carrying drivers, there are essentially 4 different limits. These particular limits are found in Section 395.3 of the Federal Safety Regulations. They are colloquially known as the 11-hour, 14-hour, 60/70-hour, and 30-minute rest break requirements, which we'll address in turn. First up is the 11-hour driving limit. This rule says that a driver must not drive for more than 11 hours during a work shift. And in order to reset a work shift, a driver has to obtain 10 consecutive hours of off-duty time. So in other words, the 11-hour rule sets the maximum number of hours that a driver can drive a CMV between each 10-hour off-duty break. So let's break this down through an example. Let's say a driver comes on duty after 10 consecutive hours off duty at home at 6 a.m. and begins driving a CMV at 7 a.m. The driver then ends driving at 11 a.m. and takes a 30-minute lunch break. She then begins driving again at 11:30 a.m. and drives until 3:30 p.m. when she arrives back at the carrier's terminal. In this example, the driver has accumulated a total of 8 hours of driving time, 4 hours before lunch and 4 hours after, during her shift, and therefore falls well within the 11-hour limit. If she then goes home and obtains at least 10 consecutive hours of off-duty time, then she will have another 11 hours of driving time available to her when she comes to work the next day. Now, the 10-hour break is important, and we'll see that it comes up quite a few times throughout this lesson. The important thing to know is that it has to be at least 10 consecutive hours of off-duty time in order to reset some of the limits that we're talking about. If the driver does not achieve 10 consecutive hours off-duty, then the limits are not reset. So looking back at our example, if the driver arrived back at the carrier's terminal at 3:30 p.m. after having accumulated 8 total hours of drive time, but then she proceeds to work inside the carrier's terminal for another 6 hours until 9:30 p.m. before proceeding home for the evening, we have to take that additional work time into consideration in determining whether her limits get reset the next morning. So for example, if she then shows up to work at 6 a.m. again the following morning, then she would have only had 8.5 hours of off-duty time the prior night, from 9:30 p.m. to 6 a.m., which means her limits have not reset. So the implication is that any driving time today will be added to the 8 hours she had accumulated yesterday to determine whether she's violated the 11-hour rule. Had she instead just obtained a full 10 consecutive hour off-duty break the night before, then the 8 hours of driving time from the previous day would reset, and she would have that full 11 hours of driving time available to her. So that's why it's critical that property carrying drivers obtain at least a full 10 consecutive hours off-duty break in order to reset these limits that we're talking about. So that was the 11-hour driving limit. We're now going to move on to the next of the 4 substantive limits for property carrying drivers, known as the 14-hour driving window. Now, this rule says that a property carrying driver must not drive a CMV after the 14th hour of first coming on duty after a 10 consecutive hour off-duty break. So in other words, when a driver first comes on duty after a 10 consecutive hour off-duty break, they have 14 hours within which to finish up all of their driving activities for the day. At the 14th hour, the driver must cease all driving activities, but could conceivably continue working in on-duty not driving status, for example, at a carrier's warehouse. So let's take our earlier example, where the driver came on duty at 6 a.m. after a 10-hour off-duty break. Here, we have to calculate the driver's 14-hour driving window from when the driver first comes on duty at 6 a.m. So 14 hours from 6 a.m. is 8 p.m. This means that by 8 p.m., the driver must have completed all CMV driving activities within that 14-hour window of time from 6 a.m. Now, like the 11-hour driving limit, this 14-hour driving window is reset by an off-duty break of at least 10 hours. Something to keep in mind with the 14-hour rule is that because it's a window of time within which driving must be complete, it's not extended by any interim off-duty breaks of less than 10 hours. So in our example, even though the driver took a 30-minute off-duty lunch break at 11:30 a.m., her 14-hour driving window still closes at 8 p.m. that evening. So that's the 14-hour driving window.